Welcome back to Big Talks because we hate small talk. Today we're getting into episode 5, which is titled My Chronic Illness is My Child. Well, it's not my kid, but I guess I'll let my wife go ahead and explain that one to you guys.
My chronic illness is my kid.
My chronic illness is my kid.
Yes.
I don't have a chronic illness or a kid, alhamdulillah.
Right.
But I'll let you go ahead and explain what's going on with this episode.
Okay, so this episode is coming after several weeks of being sick due to my chronic illness, and there's many of them, but the main one being Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which is an autoimmune disease, which I'm hoping to release some, probably an episode on what it's like and diagnosing, or not diagnosing because we're not doctors, but
recognizing what constitutes to a diagnosis, and probably also some videos on holistic ummah that are more informative types of videos. So as I was kind of just staying home, I was home for the last few weeks, really struggling through the symptoms that I was experiencing, and I started thinking about it. And a lot of the time for years now, one of the things that I've heard is about the stress and the temporary misery. I'm using the word temporary because you would hope that you're not permanently miserable by your kids, but temporary misery sometimes, the intense amounts of stress, the worry, the concern, all of the issues that arise from being a parent. I've been hearing about this for years, right? I mean, all 3 of my sisters, alhamdulillah, are parents, and almost everyone I know is now a parent. And yeah, I've been hearing a lot about that, and it's not really hearing about it that brought me to this thought, but it's this comparison that tends to happen with people who do end up having kids, is they kind of tend to feel like, or display that they feel like having kids is the only thing that really creates a certain level of stress or a certain level of issues in someone's life, which I'm not undermining at all, and I can imagine that it is one of the hardest, if not the hardest thing that you have to do in your life, or you end up doing in your life. But it just kind of made me think about it, and I was like, chronic illness is really, really hard and stressful, intense, and does create a lot of misery that doesn't feel that temporary. And then it just kind of hit me a few days ago. I was just kind of sitting down, and I was like, I don't remember exactly what it was that pushed me to that thought, but I sat there contemplating, and then I said, hey, having a chronic illness is kind of like having a kid. And lo and behold, I wrote down a list. I was able to come up with over 20 reasons why that analogy makes so much sense, which I'm going to share with you guys soon. Right. And, you're talking about the comparison, and throughout the 3 years that we've been married, I've heard plenty of stories from you where you're talking about how maybe somebody asked you about your illness, you weren't feeling well that day, and somebody asking you what's going on, and then the follow-up response was, well, at least you don't have kids.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like, it's strange. And I mean, I know you're saying that it's probably one of the hardest things to have kids, but of course this is from an angle of me not having kids and just seeing what's going on with you. But I can't say that that's like an absolute for all situations. I think it just depends on the situation, and just seeing what you go through and seeing what some other people go through with kids. I don't think that I would argue that it's probably harder to have a chronic illness. Just because, like,
there's solutions. Like, there's a lot of solutions that you can apply for having kids, you know. Like, if you're having a really bad day with your kid, you can get a babysitter, you know, or give it to the dad. You know, like, there's these different solutions that literally can remove the kid from the situation. Not that the stress is gone, but like the actual trigger of that situation can literally be removed, at least temporarily. But with chronic illness, it doesn't seem to work that way, you know. Like, it seems like it's just always there. Maybe some days it's less, but at least in your case, I've never seen a day since we've been married that you weren't dealing with your chronic illness in some way, shape, or form.
Right.
It's not like you could just call a babysitter to come and get your chronic illness away from you for a few days or a few hours or a few minutes.
You're right. Taking a break, you mean?
Right.
The thing is, I do have two responses. The first response is to what you mentioned. What was the first thing that you mentioned again? I don't even remember. Brain fog, guys.
Right, there goes one of those symptoms. The first thing I mentioned was how basically I remember...
Oh, okay, yeah, I remember. I wanted to respond to that because that typical response that I get, which is, at least you don't have kids... I don't think that's negating the chronic illness. I think my understanding of that, I mean, maybe some people are, but my understanding of that is that at least you don't have a chronic illness and kids. Because that combination is terrible. And, you know, kudos to everyone that has to deal with that combination. I don't mean terrible as in you shouldn't have kids, but I just mean it's so ridiculously hard to deal with, and I've seen people that I know deal with that.
Right.
And the second response that I had was, what you're saying is interesting. It's debatable though, and I don't think that's something that we could ever truly prove. But for me, if I were to give an opinion on it, I would say that those two things are not necessarily comparable. They're comparable in the sense that you can find similarities, which I want to share some of them just to raise awareness. That's kind of what this video is about. It's just to give you a different perspective of looking at chronic illness. Right. But do I think they're comparable to the sense of, or to the extent of saying that one is worse than the other? Absolutely not, because I think that each individual's experience is different. Each individual's experience is not static. It fluctuates depending on different needs. Yeah, sure, you might be able to hire a babysitter and get away from your kid for 5 hours, but that kid is intertwined with you and your soul beyond this life too, which is something that I always think about, because as a Muslim, you know, we believe that this life is not the permanent, everlasting life, right? We believe that this life is a temporary life that's like a test grounds. And then we end up in the hereafter. And what I would say is the hope would be that in the hereafter, if you end up in a good place, your chronic illness will not be with you anymore, right? However, with your kid, that connection exists forever. And you guys may go to the same place, you may go to different places, that's a whole nother topic. But that is something that I do think about. So it's not in any way to undermine anyone's struggle at all. In fact, the point of this episode is really just to highlight that concept itself, which is don't undermine the struggles of someone else. Because it can just be so catastrophic and so dangerous just to society as a whole. It's dangerous on an individual level, but it's also dangerous on a societal level as well. Which is something just, to really, really think about and to reflect on. And especially those of you who do struggle from chronic illness, it is really, really, really hard. It makes me think about, like, the other day when we went to Denny's, and there's this older woman. She's probably like 50-something, 60-something, based on the way that she looks. And literally both times that we saw this lady on different occasions, she commented on what we were ordering, and she was like, "Oh, well, you're young. You can have all this salt, or you could eat whatever you want, or you can do all these things." And I'm just sitting here thinking, if you knew that my blood pressure drops so ridiculously low to the point where I have friends as nurses and doctors telling me to go to the emergency room, maybe you wouldn't be making that comment, right? And it's just this lack of awareness in the world and in society in general that is so, it's painful, and people with chronic illness, they end up having a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety, and depression and anxiety are topics that I want to hit too. And, these are in-depth topics that will take really long to go into. But I think it's something that's just so relatable when you have a chronic illness, that I don't think people even really see. And so that's what I want to share as well.
Right. And, just going back to that example that you're talking about the lady who made these comments, I feel like this just goes back to that third talk that we had where it has to do with what you believe. Mm-hmm. And this lack of awareness is stemming from, for one angle, a lack of understanding, where people just don't have the knowledge. So there's a lack of awareness. They don't know any better. So we give them the benefit of ignorance. However, there's also some people that just don't take on the right beliefs based on that information, and then when you have those faulty beliefs, you end up with faulty actions, and you'll go about thinking, even if you know that different people have different struggles, that, oh, well, this person's struggle isn't like my struggle, or I'm going through something worse than this person. Or, things like that, like in that situation where the lady's saying, oh, well, you guys are young and she's old. So this is the perspective that she's looking at it from. But that belief, that fundamental belief that she's carrying into that situation is what's really leading her to saying that. So again, just to quickly highlight, it's important to know what you believe, why you believe what you believe, and take ownership of those beliefs.
Yeah.
Because you could find yourself in situations where if you're not ignorant, then you're not doing the right thing.
Right. And that's absolutely true. And as with anything in life, there are certain stereotypes that exist with those things. And I'm not someone who completely hates on stereotypes. I do ask the question, though, of where did it come from and why does it exist? Because there may be some truth and there may be a bunch of falsehood as well. There may be one truth mixed in with 99 falsehoods, and boom, that's how the stereotype exists. That's how it was created. But it is important to try to find that truth in whatever it is that exists. You can't just hold a certain opinion and just stay on a certain side just because it feels better, or just because you're comfortable with it, just because it's what you're used to, or just because it's what the media shows you, or because you see me and you think I look fine, and I think just a certain stigma that comes with illness, right? When people think of illness, they think of something that's acute. And acute just means short term and it's cured. Or it could be something chronic, but there are specific chronic illnesses that are treated as though they are the only illnesses. So, for example, you might tell someone, I have Hashimoto's thyroiditis, and I have Sjorgen's, and I have celiac, and I have all these other kinds of things. Mind you, celiac is more well known because it's, food-based or related to food intake. That's what people know about it. And then you'll have people come and be like, well, at least you don't have cancer.
Right.
And I'm just kind of sitting there like, so cancer is the only disease that exists then, right? Or is it the only thing that you think really matters?
Right.
And again, you're right. A lot of it has to do with a lack of education, certain ignorance that exists, certain beliefs that are held. And, it's just something that I think it's really important for us to break those stereotypes and those stigmas that exist when it comes to chronic illness, because chronic illness is, the reason why this video is even titled, My Chronic Illness is My Kid, is because the definition of chronic is something that is long-term or probably even forever. Now, as a Muslim, we believe that with every disease there's a cure. So I wouldn't say that for my definition of chronic is not forever. However, does that mean that in this lifetime I may reach that cure? Probably not. So I might actually live my entire life with the chronic illness and have those symptoms until I die.
Right.
But yeah, it's kind of like your kid, right? Once from the moment conception happens, your kid now exists in this world. And of course, there's some people who disagree with that, but that's not what this Big Talks is about. My opinion is, though, that existence is there, right? That being has now manifested itself into this physical world, and it is present, whether or not the soul has been breathed into it or not, whether or not you consider a cell part of existence or not, which is, something else that's debatable. But the point is, once that existence comes into play, whatever level you think it exists at, or whatever stage you think it exists at, it's now a part of you forever. It's now a part of you in this lifetime, right, and in the next. And I think that connection, that constant connection, that constant link that you have to this chronic illness, just as someone would have to their kid, is not something that people really think about. It's like when your kid is in the other room, right? You know that you still have a kid. You still have a kid, and people don't forget that you have a kid, right? But when you get diagnosed with chronic illnesses or multiple chronic illnesses, and someone sees you outside walking your cat, I'm saying cat, or doing whatever it is that you're doing, going to work that day or driving your car, it's like, oh, so I see you're feeling better today.
Right.
Or you go to the doctor and they're like, do you have pain today? And I'm like, well, yeah, I have pain every day. And then they're like, then they don't care anyway. They're just doing their job. And they're like, well, what's your level of pain? And you kind of just sit there thinking, that's like asking a parent, what's your level of tolerance? Because they got to deal with their kids' shenanigans, right? Nonsense, every day, to the point where they've built up such high tolerance now for what's happening in their lives, and they've kind of not hardened their hearts, but hardened their responses to things, right? And people don't walk up and say, well, do you have any tolerance today? What's your level of tolerance? And I'm not trying to sound ignorant here. It's just that what I'm trying to display is just how difficult that is to even deal with.
Right, especially if you've been dealing with chronic illness for like over 15, 20 years at a time. Right. Like that, you've built up a really high level of pain tolerance. Mm-hmm. And that question, when you compare it, like someone who's chronically ill, if they're saying that their pain is at a 2, mm-hmm, that could be like a 20 for someone who doesn't deal with these kind of illnesses,
Exactly.
Who doesn't have that kind of level of tolerance. So I mean, I get the whole system. I get the reason why they use that pain scale to kind of figure out what's going on, but I think it's probably not the best scale to use, mm-hmm, especially, mm-hmm, in the terms of chronic illness.
Yeah, I mean, it's like how I feel when I go to a restaurant and there's a kid crying. I just want to flip the table and walk out without paying the check.
Right. But though that parent has built up a high level of tolerance, yeah, so it's not the same level of tolerance. Exactly. That's actually a really good comparison.
That parent's kind of sitting there tolerating the kid. The parent deals with it on a daily basis. People get into fights. They're like, control your child. And the parent's like, you don't know what I go through. And, and then people are like, well, don't come into this restaurant. And that's not what this is about. It's about understanding each other.
Right.
A parent is struggling with their child. Don't ostracize the parent and make them feel like a terrible parent just because their kid is not responding well.
Right.
Because we have to understand the difference between influence and control. Can they turn a switch and switch their kid on and off? Can they turn a switch or press some buttons and make their child react in different ways? I mean, maybe we can now with what's happening in the world, but
technology,
in general, That's not what parents can do, right? And it's not fair to them.
Right.
But guess what? The same thing applies to chronic illness.
Right.
I can't just turn a switch and say that I'm not going to have a migraine at any given moment. I can't just switch some buttons and say how I'm going to react when certain things happen to me. I'm not going to be able to control whether or not I suddenly have dizzy bouts or I suddenly struggle and end up in a flare and then I can't work for a couple of days or a couple of weeks or even a couple of months, right?
Right.
And the same thing applies to parents. The same thing applies to parents in the sense of, like, for example, and these are some of the examples that I thought of, which I guess I'll just jump into if you don't mind.
Go for it.
So let's say there's two things that happen, right? You get pregnant, and during pregnancy there are many different changes that occur in your body. Now, this only applies to the woman, but
no, the men experience some changes too.
Gaining weight,
the stress,
empathizing with the wife or the mother,
loss of weight.
Yeah, stuff like that. And then when the kid actually comes into this world, there are also changes that occur as well, right? So let's just kind of go through it, right? For example, when you become a parent, you have to go to the doctor more often, right? Maybe your entire life you lived in a state of health, and then now that you have a certain responsibility and a certain risk that you have to consider, you end up going to the doctor. You get your regular checkups, you get all your blood work done. There's extra blood work. You're always getting stabbed with needles or stabbed with other tools or whatever when you go to the doctor. And it's a stressful time for you. Maybe more money goes out as well. You have to make sure that you have an insurance or some type of way of facilitating catering to these needs. And actually, the same applies to a chronic illness, because when a person is chronically ill, they'll have to go to the doctor more. It's kind of inevitable unless you just feel like dying today. There's more money that gets put out. There's more time and energy that gets invested. There is a greater risk when it comes to it. There's more blood testing that gets done and things like that, right? And this is just kind of during pregnancy. Certain symptoms that you might experience, like weight gain or extreme fatigue, or maybe just not even being able to eat what you want, or not even being able to wear what you want. Because maybe you got too big, you got to find clothes that are more comfortable for you. The baby's growing and you just can't breathe very well, and things like that. And the same applies for chronic illness. So when your body gets hit with whatever it gets hit with, whether it's your autoimmune disease got triggered, or you got into some type of car accident, you ended up with a disability that you didn't have before, or maybe you ended up with cancer, right? All of those things are things that you did not necessarily have before, but they were building over time. Of course, you just don't really notice it. It doesn't really manifest itself, right? Which is something else, to be honest with you, because pregnancy and having a kid wasn't building over time. It had a certain time period, and that was that time period. Right. Whereas chronic illness, you might have been chronically ill as a kid, struggling, and your illness had not necessarily triggered or manifested itself yet, but you still had that within you, right? So it's usually a lot more long term. But you might end up not being able to eat what you want. I can't eat whatever I want. I have tons of intolerances. I have sensitivities to the point where I will end up really sick. Just the tiniest little thing, where you might not expect that this is even going to happen to you. Obviously, you can't even imagine that there's gluten in a little shaker full of seasoning, or that there's soy in like ice cream, or like you name it, like just weird stuff that you don't really ever really think about. But now you have to be so so conscientious because you cannot eat what you want. If you have chronic pain, you cannot wear what you want. Certain materials might hurt you. Certain things are just so uncomfortable. You need that comfort. Extreme fatigue because certain aspects of your body, such as your thyroid or your adrenal glands, are just busted. Weight gain because of the same thing. There's hormonal imbalances that happen through chronic illness. People will say, well, just go out and get some fresh air. Well, just work out a little bit, lose some weight, and you'll be fine. And it's not to say that those things do not help the body, but unless something is addressing the root cause of something, then you will not find what you're looking for.
Right. Physiologically, when you're trying to work on these things, like, yeah, losing weight would be nice. That would solve a lot of problems, but your body's not in the same physiological state. So that means that the same processes that would usually work for a healthy person to lose weight just don't work in this situation because, hormones drive everything.
Right. I mean, there's like, getting frequent headaches. Frequent headaches was something that I thought about, which was funny because sometimes but sometimes people tend to feel like their kids are just a big headache and like their kids are stressing them out. And they can't think, they can't speak to someone, they can't just have a solid conversation with their friends. Their social life sucks. They used to be an extrovert when they were younger, and now they think they're introverted because they don't hang out with anyone anymore. And that's not really the case. Your personality doesn't change, but that's something we'll talk about later. Your choices change. And, your social life has begun to sink. You feel like you're suffocating. You can't even just relax. You can barely watch a TV show that you want to watch. You can barely listen to anything. Your kid's always in your face. They're always messing up everything. And I found that one kind of interesting when I thought about it because that's a figurative headache, right? But with chronic illness, and I'm not saying that parents don't get headaches, but what I'm saying is chronic illness sort of does the same thing to you. You end up in the same position without even having anyone else around. Because there is this headache or these other aches or all kinds of symptoms and feelings that could come about in a person. These feelings are constant, right? More constant or intermittent, but they're there chronically, and they get in your way. And you can't watch that show that you wanted. You can't have that conversation that you wanted. Your social life sucks. People don't understand that you're just too tired to do anything. People don't understand that you just don't have that certain amount of energy to even expend in these types of situations. You have to consider, how are you going to get from point A to point B? They just jump in their car and they drive wherever they want to go. But you're over here like, well, I've been having dizzy bouts for the last 2 weeks. So can I actually get in my car and drive and not just end up killing me? Or killing myself or someone else, which is even worse. And life just becomes so complicated. Your body doesn't facilitate you to take a break, just the way your kid may not facilitate you to take a break. When you're pregnant, you carry your child for 9 months. And then after you deliver, you probably carry your child for a few more years after that because they won't leave you alone. And you have to always continuously pick them up. And interestingly, one of the things that I've experienced with chronic illness is feeling like I'm carrying something because there's so much weight. There's so much heaviness that exists on my spine, on my arms, on my legs, even on my head, and my neck, of course. And it just literally feels like you're walking around with 10-pound weights strapped to like so many parts of your body. So when you're trying to do something, you're always being continuously interrupted, or maybe you can't do it to the best of your ability or what you would hope to be able to do it to because there's something in the way. It's like if your kid comes and you have to hold your kid and pray, or you have to hold your kid and cook, or you have to hold your kid, and I'm sure a lot of you parents do this, and it's really tough, and you're probably building muscles by now. But with chronic illness, it's something that, it does happen a lot, and it's super duper difficult because as a parent, you feel like you want to have a social life, you want to take care of yourself, you want to do the things that you want to do, but now that you have a kid to care for, and you have to take care of their needs, you have to spend extra money on them, you have to look out for them. You cannot afford to forget your kid, right? Can you just say, well, I have a kid, but every now and then I forget about my kid? And I mean, I'm not saying that they're always consciously in your mind, but you don't forget that you're a parent, hopefully, right? So interestingly, one of the things that I found when I was kind of writing up this little list was it's very similar with chronic illness. Self-care is really hard to come by. Doing the things that you want are really, really difficult. Most things feel like a burden, and you spend more money on your illness, right? Because people will say, well, you don't have kids, you don't have to worry about a bunch of expenses, you don't have to. And I don't really say anything. And those of you listening might I mean, if you've had these kind of conversations with me in person, you might be a little bit surprised about what I'm saying, because I haven't really said any of these things directly to anyone before.
Right.
But part of the reason why I don't, there's two reasons why I don't. Number one is that it's actually upsetting. And number two is that I never want to accidentally undermine someone else's struggle.
Right.
So I just listen. I intake, I absorb, and I tell people, I wish people the best, whatever struggle that they're going through. And then I leave. But the reality is that you don't know what I have to spend my money on.
Right.
You don't know how many supplements, how many medications, how many doctor's visits, how many healthcare things that need to be taken care of, how many are the expense of the groceries themselves because I have to eat this high quality food, or the risk that happens, or the risk that I take every time that I decide to go out with someone, or the repercussions and the 2 weeks in bed that come after accidentally eating something that someone gave me just because I didn't want to refuse, because people tend to get upset when you refuse food that they give you, and I'm always trying to kind of cater to everyone else and what they're feeling, what they're experiencing. And I cannot dare to forget about my illness, right? Just like you cannot dare to forget about your kid. When your kid is quiet in the other room, that's the time that you worry, right?
Right.
And and it's a similar thing when you have a chronic illness, because if you think you just forget for a minute, that you have a chronic illness. And weirdly enough, this has happened to me a couple of times in my life, where I'll eat something and then I'll immediately just start feeling sick, like I'm near death, guys. I feel like I'm near death. This is like I need to go to the emergency room type of feeling, even though I don't tend to. And then Musa will come out and be like, well, you just had this, or you just did this. And then it'll hit me and I'll be like, oh my God, that's something that I strongly react to, and I just forgot.
Right.
Because there's so much to remember. When you're a parent and you feel like, especially if you have more than one kid, right? Let's say you have 2 kids or 5 kids, right? And each kid has different things that are happening with them. You got some girls, you got some boys, they all have different needs. If you do this, then this happens, right? With each kid. And you feel overwhelmed and you're like, oh my God, there's always so much to remember. I got to write everything down. Even if I write it down, I forget to look at it. And my kids are just so complicated and I'm so overwhelmed. And then you'll look at someone like me and I'm just kind of sitting there by myself. I don't have any kids badgering me or holding on to me outside of my body, right?
Everything's internal.
And you'll think, right, and you'll think that she's fine. Look at her. She's got nothing going on. Oh, well, at least you don't have kids. Well, at least you can eat whatever you want. Oh, well, at least you're young. Well, at least your bladder holds up. People assume that you're young, so your bladder holds up, and that's not true. But what the reality is that chronic illness is so similar, because imagine each symptom is like a kid. And each symptom has a cause that makes it triggered and a different response that happens from that symptom depending on the situation.
Right.
And you have to remember all of this information, and you have a huge long list of all the things that are going on with you. And you can't dare to forget that.
Right. And it's making me think, with kids, at least you know how many kids you got. You're not suddenly going to come out of nowhere, have 5 kids, and then the next day find another kid sitting there like, when did I have this one? That doesn't happen. But with your symptoms, it's so different. Like, sometimes you'll be fine, or maybe you're dealing with a certain set of symptoms, and then suddenly another symptom comes out of nowhere, and we don't know anything about this one. We're like running around trying to figure out, well, where is this one coming from? Have you ever experienced this before? And you're
at a loss,
right? Suddenly there's another kid and you're like, where did this kid come from?
Yeah
that's kind of like that's the thought that I just had with these symptoms.
That's true. And I guess I would compare that to your kid doing unpredictable things.
Yeah.
I wouldn't necessarily compare it to having a kid come out of nowhere.
Yeah.
But definitely parents. I mean, there's a lot of unpredictability in being a parent. It's not just unpredictability in chronic illness. So
right.
I get your point, but I definitely think there's a lot of unpredictability in both.
Right.
And even just one of the last things that I came up with was. You may have worked to a certain point in your life, and you may have had certain dreams, certain goals, certain aspirations that you had for your life. And lo and behold, you got married, or you fell in love, or whatever. You had a kid. You had another kid. Sometimes you wanted the kid. Sometimes you didn't want the kid. Everyone's life is different.
Don't tell them that.
Why? Oh, don't tell your kid that. But the point is, you were not ready, or maybe you were ready. I don't know. And now you've decided that your life is going to take a different course. So you stay home now. You've become a stay-at-home mom, or a stay-at-home dad, whatever your life looks like. You stay home, you take care of your kid. You can't do your job anymore. You have to give up your dreams, your aspirations, your careers, and all this stuff. That is the epitome and the life of being a chronically ill person. Growing up, I was, and I still am, I try to be a hard worker. People see me now and they may not think that at all, because I only achieve like 10 to 20% max of what it is that I actually want to achieve on a daily basis, and it's been like that for the last several years.
Right.
So people may not see me as that type of person. The reality is, though, that being still and being lazy is so opposite of my nature that, well, not being still, I can be very still, but laziness and just having a lack of drive is so opposite of my nature that I literally will get restless and lead myself into illness just because those limitations are violated, right? Because I feel like there's so much that I need to do, and maybe there is so much that I need to do sometimes. But when I was younger, I worked really hard. I literally had 5 classes at a time, and worked a job and took care of other situations, being involved in extracurricular activities, being a president of a club, being in an honor society, still maintaining social relationships, which is really hard for me now, to be honest with you. And doing all of that, managed to get my license, managed to buy my first car on my own, managed to buy really expensive things for my family, because I wanted to, of course. And not that my parents would ever ask me to do any of that, but that's just how much I was able to accomplish, right? And then lo and behold, just like when a kid is delivered and enters this world and your life changes, you experience that when you get hit with a chronic illness, or more than one, right? The difference is, guys, well, before I get into the difference, I guess what I was leading to is that in both situations, you don't feel in control, even though you're supposed to be in control. And, we don't necessarily have control over our kids, just like we don't have control over our chronic illnesses. We are able to influence them, though. Right. And we are able to use certain reinforcements to manage our kids, manage our chronic illnesses, and if we make slip-ups, we will pay the consequence. Just kind of like, for example, if you were careless about your kid, or if you were negligent about your kid, or if you care, you love your kid, but you made the wrong choices, and then lo and behold, they end up older and now they're nothing that you expected. Chronic illness is really similar in that sense, that if you don't take care of it, it will spiral out of control. Just like a kid that spirals out of control when they get to teenagehood, and now all of a sudden they don't even care about you anymore, care about anything. And it feels that way about your illness as well, which is, your illness just doesn't have that emotional aspect that you're looking for. It's just there, and it is making life really, really, really hard for you. But getting back to the difference that I wanted to mention, because obviously none of these things are actually the same.
Right.
I really just painted this picture to talk about something that a lot of chronically ill people feel afraid to talk about and feel afraid to share, especially those who don't have kids. And that's what I wanted to mention, the key difference between these two things, because we've talked about all these similarities and we're not trying to compare them in the sense of one is worse than the other.
Right.
The key difference is that if you're someone that wanted to have your child, or even if you weren't expecting to have a child, but you felt that love for your child when they entered this world, despite all the struggle and despite all the stress and despite everything, there's a happiness that exists there. Hopefully. There's a happiness that exists there, and there's also a certain companionship that exists there as well. Hopefully. Whereas with a chronic illness, especially those who don't have kids, this is your own individual struggle. And this is you all alone dealing with this completely by yourself, and your husband could be sitting right across from you and he has absolutely no idea what you're actually feeling or going through, because he's not experiencing it and he cannot see it. A mother and a father could be sitting at the table with their kid, and they're both seeing and experiencing physically what's happening with that kid. Whereas you and your husband or your wife could be sitting at the table, and you feel like even though you're not alone, you're alone. Because this struggle is all yours to deal with by yourself. Right. Now, of course, there are many arguments that could be made about what I'm saying, such as a single parent, such as a parent that has a chronic illness, and such, right? So I am definitely not covering all of those topics in this talk.
Right.
This talk is not about that. This talk is not about just building a bunch of comparisons. It's definitely not a debate, and it's definitely not something that has to do with saying one is worse than the other. What it is really about is that people feel afraid to mention their chronic illnesses, and I've experienced this before. We live a lie, right? Which is something that I'm hoping to talk about soon, which is what you see and who you see of me isn't who I am, right? And you might think I don't have kids, but I have kids, so to speak, right? And a lot of the time people worry about mentioning their chronic illnesses, especially to people who have kids, because they're seen as maybe overdramatic. Maybe they're seen as, well, you don't know what stress is because you don't have kids. And I just want to highlight, right? We're basically reaching the end of this. I want to highlight to you guys the issue with this mentality. This mentality is so damaging, especially to people that have chronic illness and no kids, right? Because you could say that, and people that have chronic illness and kids, definitely, that's not debatable to me. I think that's probably one of the hardest positions, right? But you could say, from the angle of someone who doesn't have a chronic illness, but you have kids that, well, they have it hard because they have kids. That's what you're focusing on, right? But that's not really the case for people that have no kids at all. If they have only a chronic illness, you're going to look at them and judge them and think that they don't have any issues. That's part of the mentality that I'm talking about.
Right. And, you know, I'm thinking about all of this, and all I can think is, alhamdulillah, that we have Islam. Because, you know, through the Islamic framework of understanding things, what we have is an understanding that this life is a trial, and the different tests and the different amana, or the different trusts that Allah gives us, are tests. That's just what they are, right? So if you look at it from the Islamic angle, you look at a kid, you look at a chronic illness, they're both tests. For the parent, this test is the kid. For the person who's chronically ill, that test is the illness, right? And it's our job to try to uphold ourselves and to continue to align ourselves with truth despite these tests, which can be very difficult to do at times. But it can give you another angle of appreciation for these things, because, like, in a sense, even though this test is very difficult, it's there for you to grow, right? From an Islamic angle, you're given these tests not only for the benefit of, say, in the situation of a kid, not only for the kid's benefit, but for your benefit as well. You're supposed to grow as a person and get closer to the best version of yourself as you're supposed to be, right? And the same thing goes with chronic illness. It's very difficult, but this chronic illness, Allah gave you this chronic illness because it's the test that Allah has decided to give you, or perhaps you gave it to yourself. It's your own punishment from whatever choices you've made, but it's still there to ultimately upbring you, right? And it's, in that sense, it's kind of like your companion, because I don't know, I'm remembering this movie. There's this clip on Facebook that we saw recently about Tourette's, right? And the character in the movie, you know, the way that he describes his Tourette's, he describes it as his greatest teacher, right? And he's extremely grateful for this teacher,
definitely,
right? Because this is the reason why he is the way that he is. And even though it's been a real struggle, you know, he never let it stop him. Instead, he learned from it, and he literally, I mean, the comparison I'm trying to bring is this idea that even though it's a struggle, you're going to learn a lot from it.
Of course.
Right? And when you become a better person, this is just me watching you growing. Like, even though I see that you go through so many struggles and so much pain, and I've known you from before you had the main illnesses. I mean, you were still sick back then, but these main ones that come up these days, I can definitely say that it seems as though it was a blessing in the long run, just because you grew from it. And these are things that you wouldn't have experienced, or maybe not say you wouldn't have experienced, but the way that it was tailored, you definitely didn't let it just knock you down and, like, flatten your progress. You know, you push through it and you become a better person in the process of dealing with that trial. And you're still becoming a better person as you deal with that trial moving forward. So it's just the thoughts that I had, you know, just a little bit of
thanks.
Alhamdulillah for everything.
Yeah. That's really good insight. I don't think we can really identify why someone has the illness that they do.
Yeah,
I just wanted to respond to what you said earlier in case anyone may misunderstand what you said.
Right.
Because in Islam we believe that things can happen to you either because Allah wants them to, or as a result of some choice that you made.
Right.
So I just wanted to clarify that because you mentioned something about that. So I just wanted to clarify the two ways that we believe that something could happen, which we wouldn't be able to tell.
Right.
The only thing that we can do is just keep moving forward, right?
Right. It's either Allah wanted it to happen to you or He allowed it to happen to you.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, this episode really was just kind of to give you guys some awareness by drawing a weird comparison that we probably don't really hear about. And talking about the issue with this mentality. Just wanted to wrap up with that. is that it creates many issues. Number one being that people, when their issues are undermined by others, they could start to undermine their own issues, which in turn could make them slip up even more, make them get sicker, progress their diseases depending on what they have, create worse or more health issues. If you're someone that struggles with autoimmune disease, understand that if your autoimmune disease is not taken care of, you could develop more autoimmune diseases, which is something that we'll talk more about, inshallah, in another episode, and maybe on Holistic Ummah as well. And it could decrease the quality of that person's life.
Right.
Or probably, worst case scenario, shorten it based on their choices, right? Based on their choices, they could end up leading themselves to their own death. That, maybe if they had made better choices, things might have been a little bit different for them. And now I think someone listening in who maybe falls on the other side would argue, or could argue, why does it matter what I say? People just need to make their own decisions.
Right.
Would you say that to your kid? What if your kid is the one that has the chronic illness? You have such great influence over your child, and don't underestimate the words that you say. Don't underestimate the words that you say to your child, your mother, your sister, your father, your brother, your son, your daughter, which is your child. But don't underestimate it, Don't think that having kids is what makes someone suffer. Undermining of other people's issues, especially those who have something that you can't relate to. Like, for example, if you have kids but you don't have a chronic illness, undermining those issues can just be so dangerous. And the reality is that anything can create suffering. Anything.
Right.
And you could argue, well, it's only bad things. Yeah, but that's subjective too, right? To an extent, that's subjective. We don't know what people consider bad for them.
Right, and you don't even know if that's actually bad for them.
Exactly.
Going back to what I was saying earlier, these things don't necessarily happen as a bad thing, and I guess that's kind of why I wanted to bring up that topic about the benefits. Thinking about it from that angle of it being a positive thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's because it was just to highlight the fact that there is always a positive on this. It could be seen as a bad thing, but perhaps Allah gave it to you just to make you improve, and in that sense it was good for you.
Yeah, I mean, there's many different ways that we all suffer, and anything can create suffering. This is not a direct translation at all, but in the Quran, Allah states that you may like a thing and it may not be good for you, and you may dislike a thing and it may be good for you.
Right.
And that's just something to really hold on to strongly. Whether you're a Muslim or not, I think that it's just only logical. It's only logical. Of course, we're referencing Islam because we are Muslim, but that does not mean that that those things don't
only
need to
apply
be
to the Muslim.
And that they're not to be considered. You understand? Because this goes back to, again, just looking for the truth in things, and I don't think that that's an arguable statement. So the good news is that we do have resilience that's inside of all of us. We may not be able to find it easily. It is something to dig really deep for, to try to help us get through whatever it is that we consider suffering, or whatever it is that's suffering for us. I think one of the best things that we could do for each other is to not invalidate each other's sufferings. Validate the suffering of someone else, especially when they're sharing it with you. Because, yeah, sure, I don't have any kids. And right now, at this point in my life, alhamdulillah, I'm actually grateful for that. Just because it's really hard dealing with chronic illness. And I'm grateful for whatever Allah chooses to give me. But, yeah, if someone comes to you and they're struggling with something that you may not understand, it's the duty as a human being to another human being to listen and to respect and to just try to be open. You may not agree, you may not understand, you may not be able to apply anything that's being said because you have a different belief or whatever the case might be, right? But if certain conditions are met, or, you know, if it's just like a friend or someone that really is confiding in you or telling you about something that they're experiencing, don't try to invalidate what they're experiencing. Understand that everyone experiences something different from you. And, you know, this is such a cliche, which is, you know, you don't know what someone's going through until you've walked a mile in their shoes. I don't even think you need to walk a mile in their shoes. I think you need to just, like, get your foot in there. Because it just all depends, right? And we all know this, but do we actually apply it when the time comes? Or do we just, without thinking, start making comparisons and start, now there's a war of who has it worse, and not a war but a battle of who has it worse, and it's not necessary. You know, we rise by lifting others, and I strongly believe that, and it's something that I've seen manifest and seen it exist in this world. So yeah, it's basically just giving you guys a different perspective to look at chronic illness. This is the first episode in a series that's going to be titled Chronically Grateful. The series is going to end on that episode. I don't know how many episodes there are going to be in that series, but I really do hope you guys will tune in. We're going to talk about chronic illness symptoms. We're going to talk about diagnosis. We're going to talk about crazy stories, weird experiences that I've been through with chronic illness, things that people don't really think about. You do a quick Google search and you get these very vague kinds of explanations on the chronic illnesses. So that's something that we're going to talk about. Inshallah, we're going to talk about the angle of someone who's viewing the chronic illness happen. Because like I mentioned earlier, we live a lie. When I made that statement, I meant that when you see me, you don't see what's really happening. Musa, on the other hand, sees a much closer image of what's actually happening. And I'm sure this happens in probably just about everyone's life, whoever has a chronic illness.
All right, and even to that extent, I probably still don't see exactly what's going
definitely. So yeah, we hope that you guys will keep tuning into this series. This series may not be week after week. We're not really sure how we're going to post, but we do hope that you guys learned something, and we hope that you enjoyed it. And thank you so much for listening and tuning in.
All right. Thank you for tuning in to Big Talks, because we hate small talk.